Tonight, we're going to begin a new series. Of course, we had begun one last week, but the idea then was to do firesides. But after discussing with those of you who were attending last time, we decided to do my books instead, and that's fine with me. So, in as much as we have, as I believe I mentioned, I've published 27 books. We won't do all of them, but we'll do those that I think you would enjoy, and especially those that are in sequence. First of all, let me check, and I'm going to unmute you. Let's see, Barbara, would you unmute yourself and tell me if you're hearing me all right? Let me allow you to unmute yourself there. So, Barbara, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to mute everyone back up. There we go. Okay, let me be sure I've got everybody admitted here. And so far I do. All right, tonight we're going to discuss my most recent book, which was published just a couple of months ago, but it's only now being sold by the Baha'i distribution service, which is where most of you get your publications. It's also available through Amazon and through the Baha'i Association for Baha'i Studies. Let's see, I'm getting an echo here from something. I don't know what. Is everybody muted? Well, I'm not sure why I'm getting it. Let me share my screen, and we'll begin with the title of tonight's class, Class 84, The Body of God, a Reader's Guide to Baha'u'llah Surah of the Temple. Now, this, of course, has only in the last few years been made available as an authoritative translation, and it is one of the most important tablets of Baha'u'llah. And it was so important to him that he, after revealing it in Adrianople, then had it redone. He had it put in the calligraphic form of a pentacle or Hakel, and that's where the title comes, Surah of the Hakel. And the change he made to it, in addition, was to include 5 of the selected letters he had written to kings and rulers, and then added a paragraph at the end to put a conclusion on it. The general nature of the work is very interesting too, insofar as the structure of it. And I started writing the book by first outlining the book, which I don't always normally do. But with this, I felt in order to understand it, I had to go through the work and put it in, see how Baha'u'llah had structured it. And I'm glad I did. It took me 9 months, and I've included every paragraph in the outline. And the outline is in the book. It's part of the book. It comes after the discussion of the tablet, but we're going to look at that in a second. And so what I discovered are a couple of things. First of all, you need to understand, if you haven't had a chance to look at it in depth, but it's very important that you know right up front the setting of the work and the speakers in the work. It's basically a dialogue between the Maid of Heaven and Baha'u'llah, and the setting is in the Siyachal. So, if you will, it's a recollection by Baha'u'llah of the encounter he had. And of course, this is in a dream vision. The maid appears to him in a dream. And of course, the maid, as you may well know already, is a personification of the Holy Spirit. So she's called the Maid of Heaven, and there is Baha'u'llah dedicated several works to this figure, this female figure. Interesting that the female figure, and we're going to deal with this in a later book discussion, is often in religious literature and in just normal discussion of spiritual and philosophical things, represents the spirit, and the male represents the body. And we'll get to the rationale behind that and the origin of it in another class. So he's in the Siyachal. She appears before him, and she tells him what's about to happen, that what he must go through. But first of all, she, at least in a figurative level or a symbolic level, constructs the temple, his temple, and his temple is his body. Now let me show you how that works. The main divisions of the book consist of, and this is my book, not the Surih, of an introduction, and then I put a lot of discussion or a lot of emphasis on discussing the Baha'i lens. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that you can read this book as a piece of literature. You can read it as interesting in many ways, but the Baha'i lens means that we're looking at it from the point of view of someone who believes that Baha'u'llah is who he claims to be, and so he already assumes that we believe that there is a God, that there are manifestations, that they come periodically, and that he's the most recent of these. Then I discuss exegesis. Now, what is exegesis? Exegesis is an explanation of a work or an examination of a work in depth, a close reading of a text, usually a religious text. And of course, the only authoritative exegesis of Baha'i text will come from Baha'u'llah himself, Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, though the House of Justice can elucidate, which is a form of exegesis, but it's not an authoritative statement of meaning. Now, so my exegesis is not authoritative, but it makes what I think are some important observations about what some religious authorities have done with Baha'i literature and text. And it's part of this discussion of a Baha'i lens. What is Baha'i exegesis? We are all not only allowed to investigate the meaning of a work, we're encouraged to do so and discuss it among ourselves. So while none of us will be able to do this authoritatively, and certainly my book is not authoritative, except for those places where I have quoted The Guardian or quoted Baha'u'llah himself and so on. But places in the book where I've quoted, for example, the comments by Tahirzadeh from the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, those aren't authoritative, but they're very valuable because he gives you the history of it. And one of the interesting things that he says is, it's interesting that when you think about it, that the whole work is really between Baha'u'llah and himself. He puts it in a different way, but that's the sense of it. And I compare it in the book to what happens when an individual is meditating on something, is reflecting on something. And Abdul Baha describes that the spirit is holding communication with or communion with the rational self. And so, in effect, your conscious self is having discourse with or reflecting with your spirit and trying to understand something. There's another statement that I didn't put in the book, but I just thought of it that's very good. And that is, Abdul Baha says in one place that if you want to understand something, you focus your mind on it, and eventually the light will break through. He compares it to focusing a light on something. And I found that to be true, that if you don't understand something, you keep working at it, and eventually it will come through. And usually it will come through in various, with various levels of understanding. Then the book discusses this dialogue between the Maid of Heaven and Baha'u'llah, and she is the authoritative voice in this, and tells Baha'u'llah not only what's going to happen to him, because in the beginning he's complaining to her about what he's had to suffer and endure, and she assures him that he will be victorious, but that he will go through more to come. And then she constructs, if you will, the temple, and tells each part of the body of Baha'u'llah, the physical persona, if you will, of Baha'u'llah, the eyes, the ears, and so on, what strengths, what qualities, what attributes, what powers they must possess in order to get through this successfully. Then that ends what was the original tablet. And when he has the tablet, when in Akka, has a calligrapher arrange it in the form of a five-pointed star, which itself represents the temple, he includes the 5 letters to kings and rulers that he has selected as being particularly pertinent to the theme he is discussing. And what is that theme? Well, we'll see in just one second, as I understand it. And then finally, you have a concluding paragraph, which goes back to and concludes with the voice of the Maid of Heaven. So you need to be aware of who's speaking. So, for example, she may say, and then colon. And my understanding is that this, I don't know if that's true in every work where you have say, because you have that a lot. But the sense of it in this work is she is telling Baha'u'llah what he must tell the peoples of the world. And then in my book, I include a complete outline of the entire work, which accounts for all of the paragraphs in the work, and they are even numbered. If you have the hardcover copy of the book itself, that is the summons of that is the Surih, which is included the summons of the Lord of Hosts, you'll notice the paragraphs are numbered, and that will help you follow the outline, and vice versa. And then there are notes end notes, which will explain things that I have noted throughout the discussion. And then finally, a nice index. Now, the structure of the tablet itself is, the setting is the Sia Chow in 1863. So it's a recalling of that event where the maid appears before him. So it's in effect the first declaration, or first, Shoghi Effendi calls it the first intimation of his revelation, but it's the first declaration, if you will. And if you've been following the courses up till now, you know that there were 3 declarations, and really a 4th one in a sense. And we'll discuss those in just a second. So it was the setting of the present tense in the work is 1863, but it's being written in about 1869, this version of it. So it is discussion of the building of the temple, but the temple has various meanings, and we'll get to that in a second. It can mean, of course, the body of Baha'u'llah, but it also can mean our own bodies. It also can mean the body of God, as I will ultimately theorize at the end of the book. So the Maid of Heaven gives guidance to the temple, what it must be prepared for, what, as I say, what qualities, what powers each part of the temple must have. Then the 5 letters, the closing paragraph, and here is the structure. Now, this isn't we don't know what happened to the original, and this isn't a copy of it. This is one of the tablets that the Bab wrote. And you can probably see this well enough to notice that while it looks like it's got little filaments throughout it, that's actually the handwriting of the Bab. Baha'u'llah could not have done it by himself at this time because he had been poisoned. And if you remember, after he was poisoned in Adrianople by Mirza Yahya, his hand shook the rest of his life. And if you've seen examples of that, his calligraphy after that, there's a tremor in the lines, and something this meticulous, even though he had the capacity to do it before that, he could not have done it. And so he had someone do it for him. I theorize, and it's totally a theory, and you can take it for what it's worth, but that each of the points which represent in the Hakel the head, the arms, and the legs. That's why it represents a human being. But I theorized that perhaps he had the letters to the kings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on the points, and then the Surah Hakel itself, the body of that work, in the middle. That's just a theory. You can take it for what it's worth. So it fulfills the construction of the 3rd temple as mentioned in Zechariah, and that is the 1st temple was destroyed, and then the Romans destroyed the 2nd temple, but it was prophesied that the 3rd temple would be built. Now, as explained by Shoghi Effendi, the 2nd temple was also symbolic in the sense that it was representing the advent of Christ. So the temple, in the one sense we're talking about, is not the physical body per se of the manifestation, but the physical appearance of the manifestation. A physical edifice. And so here are the different meanings of what the temple can mean. There are others too, but I just thought I would include these for you. It's a physical edifice where people go to commune with God, and so we call the Baha'i houses of worship temples. It is a human body, which is the means by which our essential reality, our soul, manifests its powers and attributes and communes with God, or by which we become godly ourselves, assume and practice the attributes of God. It is the physical persona by means of which the manifestation makes the presence of God available to humankind. It is the physical dimension of reality by means of which humankind can discern the attributes of God and become trained and prepared to the continuation, it should be for the continuation of life in the spiritual realm. And we'll get to that at the very end, because this is the most expansive concept of the temple, I think. And that is all of creation, not just planet Earth and not just the galaxy or our solar system, but the totality of creation represents the physical aspect of the creator, not literally, even as the spiritual realm represents symbolically the spiritual or the essence of God, though both are essentially unknowable. But when you think about it, throughout the Baha'i writings, and of course the Webb telescope seems to be confirming a lot of this, as opposed to most scientists who up to this point thought the universe was limited or at least confined to us, that it was not infinite. The Baha'i writings say over and over again that the physical cosmos is infinite. And I have some things to say, a lot to say about that in the book. But suffice to say, if God himself is infinite, then it would be a nice symbolic way of understanding God. Of course, we understand God initially by our association with the physical world, with other people, but also, if you remember, throughout the Baha'i writings, you have these statements that everything in physical reality is expressive of, or symbolic, well, not just symbolic of, has something spiritual to teach us if we know how to examine it. Another theme in the work, and one of, I think it's really at least equal to the theme of the building of the temple, or the way in which the manifestation makes himself available to us. And I'll explain in a second how that theme ties in with the letters to the kings and rulers, even as this one does. This is the ringstone symbol, of course, and if you've been in the other classes, you know we've discussed this at length, but the simple way to understand it is that this top level represents the heavenly realm, the realm of the spirit. The bottom realm is the physical realm. The middle realm is the realm of command, or the realm of the manifestation. And notice on that level, you have two stars, one representing the Bab and the other Baha'u'llah. And in the same way that you have all of this calligraphy consists of two letters, the B and then the H. And the B stands for the Bab and the H stands for Baha'u'llah. So the delegation of authority is symbolized by this idea of the spirit descending through this line from the manifestation, who translates it into guidance, social and spiritual guidance, to give to humankind. So these are haikals, or five-pointed stars, pentacles or pentagrams, and they symbolize the manifestations, and of course the twin manifestations for this, the twin revelations of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. So the pentacle as a human body, as I've said, you've got the head, the arms, the legs. So if you can see, that goes into that. So going back to, okay, but what is this, the Surah is about? We've already said one thing. God, and we go back to this, God delegates authority, going back to the ringstone, God delegates authority to the manifestations and gives them the power to delegate authority to humankind. And of course, humankind is governed by, at the time of Baha'u'llah, these kings and rulers of empires and nation states. But they symbolize or represent all kinds of governments. So you have really from God to the manifestation, from the manifestation to the rulers of governments, and from the leaders of governments to the generality of human beings. So that's one of the themes here. Why does he include 5 letters when he's talking about the temple? 5 letters to these selected letters of particular kings and rulers, precisely because they represent the means by which society can become changed. And his cautionary statements to them focuses on justice, focuses on ceasing to persecute people of religion, particularly the Baha'is, and to heed his advice about forming a pact of collective security. And this is where Baha'u'llah, in the letter to Queen Victoria, gets into the two kinds of peace, the lesser peace and the most great peace. And in that letter, he says, now that you have rejected, and he's talking to all of the rulers when he says that, the most great peace, do what you can to accept the lesser peace, to bring it about. And the way you'll do that is to formulate a pact, and that pact will, and we've been over this before, but it will define the borders of nations, the agreements among nations, and more importantly, it will have a collective commonwealth. And of course, as we said before, when we're talking about the distinction between the lesser peace and the most great peace, the lesser peace will be secular, and it will evolve simultaneously as the Baha'i administration and the Baha'i faith is spreading throughout the world. So you can, on one hand, see the lesser peace as the evolution of a concept of governance at the level of the rulers, while the faith is really, particularly in the 9-year plan, continuing to emphasize working at the grassroots level, community level, where any important change from which it must emanate. So, the delegation of authority, the construction of the temple capable of conveying divine guidance and manifesting divine attributes, having rejected the most great peace, strive to attain the lesser peace. Now, this is something I learned because I had misunderstood this before I started working on this book. And frankly, that's the main reason I write books, is because it imposes a discipline on my own study that I probably wouldn't have without it. It's sort of like assigning myself a job, the reward for which is sharing with others to a certain extent. That is obviously that gives me a sense of pride and so on in doing that. But the actual satisfaction I get is I understood, it brings me to understand not the totality of any work by any means, but things that I would not have understood without devoting myself to trying to explain what I think I see in the work as I go through it. And one thing that I learned as I went through this is, wait a minute, why does he say they've already rejected the most great peace when he says to each of them, if you will do this and so, thus and so, you will help bring about the lesser peace, but you have rejected the most great peace because you have rejected me. And of course, all of them did. So the most great peace, of course, it will come about eventually anyway. But his point was that by rejecting my statement to you, in the case of Napoleon, he rejected the first letter, and so Baha'u'llah predicts what will happen to those who have rejected to him, those leaders, and they will lose their empires and so on. And if you remember in a previous class, we discussed how the people, particularly in India, because this is one of the first works that Baha'u'llah had published during his lifetime, and it was published in India. And so they were waiting, eagerly anticipating, as members of the global body politic, when these things he predicts would come true, to see if he was right in some cases, and because they knew he was right, to see if these rulers would indeed suffer what Baha'u'llah says they will. And of course, as we've also said before, the Promised Day has come is a discussion of what did and how these things did come true, and how what he predicted would happen did happen to each of the recipients of these letters. So, at any rate, that was a long-winded explanation, but suffice it to say, I thought when he wrote the letters that they still had a chance to. Let me put it this way: I thought that they would have gotten the most great peace had they gotten together and formed the collective pact, or the pact, and with the one of the elements of that pact being collective justice. But no, the most great peace can only come when you combine that secular structure with the understanding of who Baha'u'llah is, and accepting Baha'u'llah and following the structure that Baha'u'llah has laid out for human governance and so on. And the laws, most particularly the laws of the Agdas. First and fourth declarations of Baha'u'llah's station and mission. Now, what am I talking about here? If you remember in previous classes when we talked about, we're most familiar with two declarations of Baha'u'llah, first in the Siyachal, and then in 63, excuse me, did I say 63? It was 53 when he, so I need to change that on the slide. It was in 53 when he had the intimation of his ministry, of his revelation. And then in 63, he declares, that is, I was right, it is the first declaration. So you have the declaration of the maiden to Baha'u'llah that now you are the one chosen to carry out this dispensation. Then 63, when Baha'u'llah declares it both to his family and then to the believers themselves. And then third, in Adrianople, when he sends the letters to the kings and rulers declaring his mission to the world. And of course, while some of the letters in this document of the five had been written before this, a couple of them were written as part of this work. The most important one and the longest one, in fact, it's longer than all of the four other letters put together, is the last one to Nasiruddin Shah, the letter that Baha'i was chosen at the age of 16. He would reached the Shah when he was 17, carried to the Shah, and of course had been assured by Baha'u'llah, or forewarned by Baha'u'llah, that he would be executed for this, because the Shah would take it as an insult, having thought he had gotten rid of this religion and Baha'u'llah, and then he gets this long letter. Some very interesting things about that letter, but at any rate, but that letter was revealed before this document, but it wasn't delivered till afterward. Then this, I think, is very interesting insofar as the repetition of this concept of the body of the manifestation is the temple of God, the body of God. This is not the sole basis for my titling the book, The Body of God. I was really thinking more in terms of the totality of physical reality being the body of God, but it works on various levels, as many of the writings do. So compare this to what Jesus said when Philip asked him, who is this Father you're going to? When Christ says in John 14:9, soon I'll be going away, I'll be going to the Father. And Philip says, tell us, who is the Father? Who are you talking about? And Jesus saith unto him, have I been with you so long time with you, and yet hast thou not known me, Philip? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. And how sayest thou then, show us the Father? Believest thou not that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. Now, this is interesting in at least two ways. One, as Baha'is, are those studying the Baha'i faith, you need to know that we believe the manifestation is the most perfect understanding we will have of God, and the presence to them, obviously we're talking about spiritual presence, not physical presence, is the same as proximity to God. So when Christ says this, it is taken by Paul and other Christians, particularly the what become the Protestants. But you have this becomes a great debate in Christianity that's not resolved, well, not ever really resolved, but it is made doctrine at the Council of Nicaea that Christ and God are one and the same, that he is very God of very God, and that there is no difference between them, that he is God. And you can see why this passage would be understood by some to mean that. But what he's saying is there's nothing in it. He's saying the same thing Baha'u'llah says, and this is from the Surih. The 24 shouldn't be there. Naught is seen in my temple but the temple of God, and my beauty but his beauty, and in my being but his being, and in myself but his self, and in my movement but his movement, and in my acquiescence but his acquiescence, and in my pen but his pen, the mighty, the all-praised. There hath not been in my soul but the truth, and in myself naught could be seen but God. And so, I mean, that sounds very much like the same thing. Well, I think it's exactly the same thing Christ is saying. But relating the temple, since the book is called, or the tablet is called the Surah of the temple, and he's saying, if you see me, you see as much of God as you will understand, which, if you'll recall, we've said in other classes, this is precisely what Yogi Effendi says, whether we're talking about in this life or in the life to come, that our understanding of God is the most we will ever understand is by understanding the manifestations. We will understand other things about God, but he's talking about understanding the essential reality of God rather than the nature of God. So this is not an outline, but it's in the form of an outline. It's actually the table of contents. So you can see the first chapter, some tools necessary. So you can see I spend a lot of time up front for the reader talking about various subjects that I think are essential to understanding what tools one needs to go about studying this work. So, for example, you see down here, I talk about the 4 declarations. The declaration of the 4 we just mentioned. So let's see, the temple and the ontology of the manifestations. What is that talking about? Well, we've talked about that before, but how are the manifestations distinct from ordinary human beings? And we've talked about that. So I get into that to be sure we understand who Baha'u'llah, in other words, I don't assume that the reader knows what Baha'is have come to believe about the manifestation and their authority and so on. The history of the delegation of authority, and this has to do with, of course, progressive revelation, the various stages, and that we are now entering the stage of maturity. And of course, the turning point of that is the advent of Baha'u'llah, and you have to be aware of that to appreciate the tone with which he speaks to the rulers and so forth. what the Baha'i perspective, why the Baha'i perspective is essential to this study. And I go into, again, the fact that we believe that history is impelled, or history is carried forward by degrees, as much as people can accept or understand or utilize at a particular time. And each comes in a cultural context. So we can say, well, look how many things Baha'is believe and accept that you can find in the Quran. And yes, that's true. It's closer to Islam in one sense than it is to Christianity, certainly. So not going to go into detail in these, but the second chapter is still preparatory. It's not yet discussing the work itself. It's still discussing what is exegesis and how is it applied to this work. And in particular, I get into what this sounds very highfalutin, but it's really not. The epistemological limitations of a materialist perspective. And that is, if you don't believe in a spiritual reality, or that these beings, the manifestations, are who they claim to be, then you're going to have some trouble explaining how the Bab, who never went to school, of course, he took some classes when he was little, but if you remember, one of the stories is the teacher sent him home because he says, I can't teach him anything. He knows everything I know. But he was a mere merchant, and then all of a sudden, he declares himself to Mullah Hussein and reveals spontaneously the first part of the Qayyum al-Asma, the explication of, or examination or exegesis of, the Surah of Joseph from the Quran, which is very interesting if you read the Surah of Joseph, by the way, as well as the Bab's explanation of it. So I discuss what do we do with exegesis and hermeneutics and the assumption of authority. And what I'm talking about here is that if you are a scholar in history, for example, your colleagues are not going to accept a non-material explanation for why the Bab can suddenly do this when he's never had studied with any scholars or anything like this, and suddenly he can come forth with this beautiful and exquisite textual examination of this, perhaps the most interesting story in the Quran, and certainly one of the most abstruse. So the fact that he can explain it in detail, he compares it to what happens to Baha'u'llah, of course, because in the same way Joseph is put in a well and left to die by his own brothers, so Baha'u'llah is persecuted by his brothers. And so on, and I could go on, but let us go through this, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. So, at any rate, you have a number of things discussed here in regard to what is authoritative exegesis from the Baha'i point of view. What's the difference between an interpretation and a translation? And so on. So this is prefatory information that I think is helpful to the reader, or at least to some readers, about what the Baha'i, further discussion of what makes the Baha'i approach distinct from much of the secular scholarly approaches, though hopefully that won't always be so. And then we have third and fourth chapters, the context and key symbols, of this, and of course the Haeckel that we've just discussed. Those of you who've taken English literature may have read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I bring that up here because he's called the Pentagular Knight. He is his symbol is the five-pointed star on his shield, on the outside of his shield, because it symbolizes his physical qualities, his physical strength. On the interior of his shield is a picture of the Virgin Mary that represents his spiritual protection. So that's what protects him. I bring that up to show that in history, the pentacle has a bunch of different meanings. Of course, some of them have to do with things like Satanism and mystical things and so on. So to start, I began discussing the construction of the temple, both as the literal edifice and the symbolic edifice, and then the construction and preparation of the temple. Now, here's where we're getting into the work itself more specifically, and these are the page numbers where the Maid of Heaven addresses Baha'u'llah, or at least his physical edifice, and addresses his eyes, the ears, the tongue, the feet, the breast, and the inmost heart, fuad. And what they must have, what powers they must have, and so on. Then chapter 5, what the maid inspires Baha'u'llah to say. Now this gets into summarizing what are some of the themes that she says you need to say the following things. One is one of the themes is the theme of grace. The final and most lengthy homiletic matter. Let's see, talks to the people of the Bayan, what they must be, what he must tell them, and so on. Of course, mainly what he tells them is what we've discussed before, and that is, according to the Bab himself, they must turn to Baha'u'llah when he appears, him whom God will manifest. And then the trumpet call. Of course, this is the second trumpet call. The first is the advent of the Bab. And so then you have the 5 letters, the letter to Pope Pius, the letter to Napoleon III, the letter to the Tsar, the letter to Queen Victoria, and finally the letter to Nasiruddin Shah, part 1. And look how long this is. This goes from in my book from page 145 all the way to 178. So it's quite a lengthy discussion of those letters, and these are the main topics in that. And I think you'll find this very helpful in seeing what the content of these letters are. Now, one thing interesting before we finish and you ask whatever questions you think you would like some discussion of. One thing I found that was particularly interesting to me about the letters is that he praises the Pope. He does not praise. He is quite stern with the Pope, of course, particularly because the Pope doesn't recognize him as the second coming, when this is one of the most important the most important prophecies in Christianity. Also, it is in Islam. But one of the things I found interesting is that Napoleon III and the Tsar and the Queen Victoria had done some very good things for the people, and Baha'u'llah praises them. He's very gentle with all of them, and those who have, for what they have done wrong, he says it's the same thing he does for Mirza Yahya. It's not too late for you to change, and the main thing he says is, you think you have power now. If you accept who I am, and follow through with what I'm asking you to do, your name will go down eternally in the history of humankind on this planet. You will be the most important ruler that has yet appeared, or that will ever appear. And you can imagine that they would have been. I mean, notice how highly we regard Queen Marie of Romania, who became a Baha'i. And the other thing is that, let me see. The last paragraph is particularly important. But this chapter here, the contemporary relevance, I think, is perhaps, as it should be, the most important discussion of how is this tablet relevant to what's going on now. And of course, it doesn't take much imagination to see why it's relevant, so far as the dire need we have to form a collaborative world government, that we're pushing the limits on every aspect of our society, our global society. The Surih and the path to the lesser peace, which he says, now that you've rejected that, choose that. And I bring up what I have in classes before, things like the COVID pandemic, how that has led many men of learning to say this is another example of why we need a world government. Well, I could go on. The birth of a new vision, a new plan to usher in the new age. This is talking about the 9-year plan, an active approach to the lesser peace, and so on. And this has to do with the fact that Baha'u'llah says, or I think it's the Guardian says, the extent to which Baha'is do their job of establishing this foundation at the community level will mitigate the degree of suffering that humankind will have to endure when things get so bad that ultimately it will result in rulers having no choice but to heed his advice. All right, and then finally I close with this. This is, again, one of the many incredible pictures from the Webb telescope, where we usually think of the night sky, with a few stars there. But if you've ever looked at the night sky through a telescope when you don't have any ambient light, you can see that it's just masses of stars. And this gives you a better idea. It looks like there's no space. There's just all cluttered with planets and galaxies and so forth. This is just amazing. So the idea that there's limitation here is not particularly acceptable. And I in the Q&A, if you want, we can get into that. So that's it. Let me stop sharing